So I think we can get started now. We have quite a few participants already in the room. Welcome everyone to today's discussion panel. We will speak about certifiers. Are they part of the solution or part of the problem? The dam break of Brumadinho. I will give you a few technical introductions before I present our panelists today. This event is with simultaneous translation. So for those who would like to change the language, you can do that if you go to the bottom of your screen. You see a whole row of different symbols. And if you go to the very right end of that line of symbols, just before leaving the Zoom session, you see one that is a little round globe and that says translation or interpretation. And if you click on that with your mouse, then you can choose English or Portuguese as a channel. Intento en español, mi portuñol está muy mal. Si ustedes quieren escuchar el evento en portugués, ven abajo de la página Zoom una línea de diferentes símbolos y a la derecha hay un pequeño globo donde ustedes pueden hacer clic con el ratón y escuchar y seleccionar el canal de portugués. There's also a Q&A function for questions and answers in that line of symbols next to the symbol participants. And there you can put in your questions and answers, mainly questions or comments, especially in the last part of our event when we open the forum for more questions to be asked. You can there also vote on questions that you would also like to ask. So the more votes a question has, the more likely is it that it will really be discussed in the limited time that we have. And you can also comment on question or add aspects on questions that you like or want to amplify. The chat function is not open to you. Instead of that, you have the Q&A function. So I think with those technical instructions, we can now start really the event. And I'm very happy to welcome you all, and in particular to welcome our panelists of today. Before that, I would like to thank also the many organizations and co-organizers of this event. First of all, Maria Arena, who's also with us today on the panel. Thank you very much for co-hosting this event. Then there is also Renser, our Brazilian partner organization, and Caritas Brazil. Also with us as co-organizers is SITSE and Miserior, as well as DKA Austria, and of course the organization that I also represent, ECCHR. We start talking about the dam break that happened in Brazil, in Brumadinho in 2019. That was just the day before yesterday, 3 years ago, 25th of January. You probably have all heard of it at the time and also later. It's been one of the biggest environmental disasters or crimes with really disastrous consequences that still persist today. Even not every fatal victim has been found. There are still 6 victims that were killed and are not found until today. And of course, if you think of the environmental consequences that are persisting until today, of course. We are talking about this today, and in particular also about the European companies that are related to this. Today, we specifically will talk about the German company TÜV Süd, which is a certifying company that has a role to play in this crime because they have issued a stability declaration shortly before the dam broke, which was not correct. And so the public authorities in Brazil did not intervene, even though it was clear that the dam was not stable. And that meant that the dam break to the people in the area came very suddenly. They couldn't find rescue anywhere, and this led to the disastrous consequences. So in Europe, we have a trend in several countries now towards a mandatory human rights due diligence. That means to feed the united guiding principles on human rights obligations as far as corporations are concerned into laws, into mandatory laws. We have a law like this already in France. We have it in Germany now recently. There has been a long discussion that the push is still going on in Switzerland. It has been difficult. And there's several countries that have ongoing discussions. And now, of course, also at the EU level, this discussion has arrived, and Maria Arena will tell us a little bit more about it in a few minutes. So the question is a little bit, how do we connect these two situations? What does it really change? Or how can we make sure that such laws really change something on the ground in the regions where people are at risk because of risky business such as mining? Let me present our guests on the panel today. We have with us Maria Arenas. She is a member of the European Parliament. She belongs to the Parti Socialiste in Belgium and also to the group of the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats in the European Parliament. And there she chairs the subcommittee on human rights, among several other functions. She has also served in the Belgian Parliament for several years and in the government of Belgium. Before then, she was elected to the European Parliament. We have also Danilo Chamas from Brazil. He is a lawyer and human rights and environmental activist from Brazil. He has worked for decades now with resistance movements against mining projects. His work stretches from hands-on solidarity work in affected communities in Brumadinho and also other regions of Brazil to advocacy at the international level, for example, with the UN, the OECD, also the European Union and European governments. He works now as a consultant with RENCER, the regional episcopal team in Brumadinho under the guidance of Bishop Dom Vicente de Paulo Ferreira. We have also Ben van Peperstrate, who studied sociology and anthropology, and his expertise is specifically in the field of labor rights, human rights due diligence, and international trade. He was involved, for example, among many other things, in developing the Bangladesh Accord on fire and building safety, and is currently working as a consultant on EU advocacy with the ECCHR, the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights, which is a human rights organization, for those who don't know us, that focuses on strategic legal interventions. So let's get right into the conversation. I would start maybe with Danilo, who is with us directly from Brazil, from Brumadinho, in fact. And I wanted to ask you, Danilo, what are, until today, the effects of the dam break for the people, for the different groups of people that are in the region? These impacts are probably different, say, for the people who live in the town of Brumadinho compared to people who live in the rural areas. There is also indigenous communities further down the river. And close to Brumadinho, about an hour away, is a metropolitan area of Belo Horizonte, which, as I hear, is also affected. How is the situation for all those groups of people today?
Boa tarde. Em primeiro lugar, muito obrigado.
Good afternoon. For starters, I would like to thank you all for the invitation. I would like also to greet all of my colleague panelists, our moderator, and also all of those who are connected from different countries. I'm really happy to be with you. It's correct. I am working here in Brumadinho, and I have been working here since the terrible facts of 2019. I listen to different people and groups. They organize many meetings, and over the past few years I took part in many initiatives because many people still feel the heavy impact of those facts. They are actually traumatized. there are mothers who lost their children, and therefore they are claiming for justice. Another woman spent grieving a long time, and only now can they fight to claim what is theirs. Some lost cousins, nephews, brothers, brother-in-law, sisters-in-law. Just imagine the amount of family members of loved ones of these 260 people who all of a sudden lost loved ones in a very cruel way. Vabrum is the Association of Families of Victims, and they even have a song that remembers that. There's also the families of farmers who lost their properties and the source of income. They feel the impact in a very specific way, just like the indigenous people, the quilombolas, those who live off river fishing. They have lost their subsistence, basically. And there are also people who did not lose family members, but the family was contaminated, and many of their friends got sad, got depressed, and many moved to third sector or started working in other activities. They had to move out of that area because they needed to have like a new life. The people who were here earlier talking about, you know, the risks of mining were really demonized, stigmatized, and these people feel most hit by these events, due also to the psychological effect of it. Many people still need to deal with sadness, grievance, fear, especially when it comes to the impacts on health and the fact that mining operations might be restarted. People also have to deal with impunity, with the lack of adequate reparations and the violations of rights that have happened day in, day out. Out of the 272 people that were killed instantly in 2019, 6 people are still missing. Their families are hoping for the bodies to be recovered so that they can organize a proper and decent funeral. Thanks to the admirable persistence of the family groups, the firemen keep seeking for these bodies. And the families really made a deal. They won't stop until they recover the very last body of these missing people. We still feel the impact of this tragedy in our cultural but also environmental heritage. For instance, children today cannot swim in the river as their grandparents did, for instance. And also agriculture is impacted. Some tracks that were attractive for tourism cannot be used today. Despite all of that, companies and the Brazilian authorities insist in mining activities. This should have made a difference, but we still have 40 tailings dams that are in a kind of emergency situation. In addition to the risk of failure, of dam failure, and so the potential contamination of water that provides water resources to many people, we are observing with increasing concern the expansion of mining. Mining destroys water tables, fundamental water resources, especially given the current situation of climate change. At this moment in time, many people in Brumadinho are trying to make an effort to overcome the floods that occurred in the early days of this year. There were heavy rains and therefore floods in Brumadinho and in all of the area. January was a very tough month. We had to organize activities and ceremonies to commemorate the victims. The pain for this sludge flood really is still very much alive, because with the flooding we were really reminded of everything that happened, and seeing all of that mud everywhere, we were painfully reminded that of what happened. We still had to clean mud from our houses, for instance. Thank you. That is all for my first question. Microphone, please. It's off.
We can't hear you.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Danilo, for your presentation. I wanted to ask, there have been several compensation agreements signed since over the last years. The biggest one a few months ago, according to which Vale, which is the mine operator, has to pay 37 billion reais, which is in euros around, I think, 6 billion at the moment. And also criminal charges have been brought against 16 responsible officers, both of the company Vale, which operates the mine, as well as the certifying company TÜV Süd, that was in January 2020. Now, why are then survivors and activists still claiming justice and reparations? If things seem to be moving, what do you think is still missing? And also, can you tell us a little bit whether TÜV Süd in Brazil has been asked also to pay reparations? And if so, how have they reacted to that?
A TÜV Süd já testou a
TÜV
estabilidade.
Süd tested the stability of the dam in June and September 2018. The investigations of the public prosecutor and the different officials determined that the dam was unstable, and therefore they put pressure on the people from Vale. Also, it appeared that a member of TÜV Süd was aware of these discrepancies. In February 2020, they started a criminal action in Brazil against 16 natural people linked to TÜV Süd and Vale, due to basically environmental crimes. For instance, there was a German manager of TÜV Süd and the chairman of Vale. It was acknowledged that there were evidence of the fact that they were aware of problems and that they took the risk of putting at risk people's lives and causing environmental damage. They basically hid information and they didn't take any measure to limit the impact of the tragedy, basically, like causing a detour of the sludge flooding. Then the criminal offense was quite intermittent. It took ages to identify and notify the accused parties. There were extensions of the time to present the counter defense arguments, for instance, and that caused additional problems to the trial. Some argued that the people in Minas Gerais were not competent to basically judge on this. And in October last year, that is to say 2021, the Supreme Federal Court basically said that 2 of the accused parties were right, and they acknowledged the incompetence of the federal judge. And in this way, they eliminated all of the effects of the trial that was started back in February 2020. At the moment, the criminal suit, the criminal case is blocked. We do not have any accused party, and we are just waiting for the judgment of the Constitutional Court for an appeal that was lodged by the public prosecutor here in Minas. The federal police closed their investigations because the final report came to the a conclusion that 19 people were indicted in addition to Vale and Tuksud. We do not have any news about any further denunciations or indictments by the federal ministry. Together with ECCHR and Miserere, we prepared we lodged a formal complaint with the public prosecutor in Munich on behalf of 5 women and their families. And basically, we reported the criminal actions of Vale and Tuksud. The offenses are basically homicide, corporate corruption, as well as neglectful behavior. The legal person is also accused of violating its auditing duties because the offences took place as part of their activity. The investigations are in the process of being finalized in order to identify the liabilities of all of the parties accused. As part of the civil action, the collective reparations action did not include Tuksud. Tuksud is not part of the 6 billion euro agreement, and it doesn't recognize or acknowledge its liability, and it didn't take on any obligation in terms of reparations. The subsidiary of Tuksud in Brazil received basically a decision by our court that bans it from operating in the mining area. And also they had to pay a deposit of 10 billion euros. The subsidiary of Tuksud in Brazil basically acted against the state because they didn't perform their auditing activity properly, and therefore they violated the anti-corruption legislation of Brazil.
Thank you, Danilo. Let me go over to Ben and look a little bit more at what is the European role in those constellations, because clearly Brazil needs some support here because it's not enough what's happening. Even though we know there's a lot happening, but it's not yielding results so far, and the survivors need results. So in the invitation, we were quite bold, and we asked whether the European due diligence law that is currently underway or in development could help that such crimes would be prevented. Now, looking at the certification industry, maybe that's a bit ambitious, but it's also the defense of the certification industry. They always say, well, we are not in the operational part of operating a mine, so we can't really do anything. And we gave recommendations in this case, and Vale ignored it. So what do you think? What is your assessment? You've got also a lot of experience with social auditors. You've talked to some of them. You know how the situation in practice really is on the ground between operating companies and certifiers. And what do you think is really, do they have any influence? Can they really change things?
Thank you very much, Claudia, for the question, and thank you very much first also for bringing this panel together at an important anniversary and bringing people together. So good evening, everybody, and boa tarde. I think the panel asks the right question. Can a certifier like TUV prevent such a collapse from happening? And there, of course, the answer is no. But at the same time, I'm going to immediately totally nuance that by saying, like, well, TUV could have done a lot of steps which would have possibly prevented either the collapse or at least the collapse being generating so much casualties. And I think that's very important to stress, because I think the first thing that, of course, TUV could have done was not falsify the certificate. That would be a very good first step. And let's recognize and emphasize that they've actively had knowledge that the dam structural integrity was not sufficient. But not only did they just sit on the knowledge? No, they actually transformed it into something positive, saying like, no, as far as we can see, everything is okay. And that's basically a lie, which has, as a result, also provides Vale with cover in saying like, yeah, but we received a certificate from TUV, so they said at that moment to us that everything was fine, so can you expect that from us? So they do generate this feeling of nobody is actually responsible, and they've actually actively done actions in order to create that feeling. So there is entities who then just point to each other, and the creation of that situation is clearly something that could have been prevented. They could have been very clear, saying like, listen, we found structural deficiencies, we advise you to look at them, and in the meantime we also advise to set, for example, a safety perimeter around the dam, unless we can until the moment that we can renovate it to such extent that the risk that we're detecting is dealt with. And I think it's, as a second point, it's very important to say that this is also not an isolated case. As you already implied, wherever we find auditors and certifiers, whether it's technical audits or whether it's social audits, etc., we also do find quite a trail of breast implants leaking despite certification, factories firing, and we all see like impacts, human rights impacts that could have been prevented if those certifiers had done their job, and even more, if they had done their human rights due diligence. So if they were actively looking for risks and impacts and how they're connected to risks and impacts to human rights, and actually actively sought to mitigate, then a lot of things would be possible. Because in this case, TUV would not only have to say, okay, I found problems, and Vale, here's the analysis that we did. They should have even said, Vale, okay, we think you should actually start addressing them and be proactive about that. So they should have actively, when they found the problems, also become part of the solution, of course, dependent in the relationship to the specific impact. So from that perspective, it's very good to emphasize that auditors, certifiers, multi-stakeholder organizations are not only a subcontractor in a due diligence process, but are also just companies with their own human rights due diligence expectations. And once that the EU comes up with an instrument, also will have human rights due diligence obligations, where they need to seek out what are issues, how can they impact human rights, and if they're severe, start addressing them immediately, and if they're less severe, then after the severe impact, in a classical due diligence process. So from that perspective, the obligation, a legal obligation to do human rights due diligence, and if TUV had diligently followed that, could have indeed possibly prevented, maybe not a collapse, but could have maybe prevented that the collapse would result in lethal consequences, or at least lethal consequences of the magnitude that we've currently seen. And secondly, even if there was an impact, it would have also brought a different attitude of TUV in dealing with the remaining impacts, because also human rights due diligence, let's not forget it, the OECD constantly emphasizes that that also has an obligation to provide remedy as an integral part of the HRDD process once mitigation has not been entirely successful, which is also a totally different attitude than what we currently have seen with TUV saying like, yeah, okay, but we have a subsidiary and look at Vale and basically look at somebody else. So from that perspective, yes, an EU law, a German law, a transposed law would have possibly prevented the lethal consequences.
Yeah. Now you said that such false certificates or problems with the certificates with the reliability is not an isolated case. And you've mentioned, for example, the breast implant situation that some might recall that has been a scandal a few years ago. And we see, in fact, that certifiers are moving into the field of social and sustainability audits that's quite relevant for human rights questions increasingly. And they for example, there's the labor rights and social auditing. The SA 8000 is one certificate that's very broadly known and very often also required by the buyer companies, and that's related to labor conditions. Then is another example is the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil, RSPO, where it is really attempting to address questions of land rights, customary rights, indigenous rights, the dangers of the risks of pesticides use for water and the environment. So a broad range really of human rights. And certifiers, you mentioned the multi-stakeholder initiatives, but also certifiers like the family of TÜV, there's TÜV Süd, TÜV Nord, TÜV Rheinland, quite a number of certification companies under that family. They also enter into these fields. They're not only dealing with technical questions, but with social audits, that's sustainability audits. And ECCHR has published a study to compare these different sectors and has also found, as you said, it's not an isolated case, this case of Brumadinho. I may recall also that 3 years before Brumadinho happened, another dam broke also in Brazil, which was Mariana. Many people have heard of it. It was a huge disaster. And the constellation was very similar. It was again a stability declaration that was falsely emitted by a certification company, in that case, a Brazilian one. So the ECCHR study is called Human Rights Fitness of the Auditing and Certification Industry ? And can you tell us a little bit more about where are the problems really in the certification industry, say more structurally, if one can say so?
Yes, this sector, although as you rightfully said, is a very broad sector, because you have auditors, certifiers who certify land, cocoa beans, trade union rights, dam integrity. So the field is very complex, and in that sense also a bit differentiated. But a lot of these, but at the same time, dominated by quite big companies and highly profitable. Let's first start with that, because most of these companies come from either product certification, so think UL, etc., or TUV. The TUV family that you refer to, they're separate companies despite their own name, but they're like checking German cars originally. Or they come from naval certificates and naval shipping. So think RINA, Bureau Veritas, etc. And those are the classical sectors where they come from. And what these bodies, these entities, these companies have seen is that actually adjacent and that field starts expanding. Like, oh, if I do product certification, maybe I can also do process certification, or I can do the social value certification, etc. They kept on expanding to more sectors and more angles, including social compliance, environmental compliance, technical compliance, etc. And also what they found is that these other sectors are actually largely unregulated. So, for example, if I do in Belgium, I'm also Belgian, next to Mrs. Arena, if I want to certify an organic vegetable, I do need to respond to certain criteria of the government that they lay on me. But if I start certifying the trade union rights in a factory, I don't need to have any proven competence whatsoever. I can just do that tomorrow and charge whatever I want to whomever wants to pay me for that. And I think there we come to a number of the essential problems, namely a totally unregulated market, where basically one company asks another company, I give you money to police myself, to check at the integrity or quality of how I'm doing. And as a result of that, you see in the more political economy of that landscape that a company does not automatically want to have a rigorous certificate. They just want to have a certificate. And so if TUV Zoet does it for 10,000 euros and TUV Rijnland does it for 5,000 euros, why would you go for 10,000 euros if you get the same certificate at 5,000 euros? So there is quite a lot of competition driving the price down, which also then reduces mandates, quality, etc. So already the chance of detecting in such a system where whatever needs to be checked is actually paid by either the economic entity or a buyer or a business partner is already fraught with conflicts of interest. But the market itself drives down quality, which gives a problem of identification. So you have a large under-identification of risks and issues. That's not a problem here in the case of Brumadinho. In Brumadinho, the problems were detected. But even if you have detection, there's also an incentive to under-report. Because if I give you a bad certificate, for example, they could have said, TUV could have said to Vale, yes, we found deficiencies, and we think you should actually actively work on addressing them, and in the same time also make sure that there is no potential impacts to people around the facilities. But they didn't do so because Vale is also in a more important commercial relationship. So the moment you give negative certificates, is often in a lot of contexts also a very good strategy to quickly come out of business. So in that sense, there's underreporting. And then if you look at the third step, what you would see that after under-identifying, under-reporting, you also see under-addressing, under-remediation, because you give your certificate to whomever pays it. And after that, it's hands-off. You are no longer responsible to that. So in that sense, it is important that we recognize that these certifiers, these auditors, the social auditors, the compliance initiatives, that we recognize that they have the human rights due diligence obligations as any company in their own right, but equally that we should also look at, should we actually set more specific standards on them? And then I come back to, for example, my example of the organic tomato that we do see where there are specific minimum quality standards, both on what needs to be checked and also on how it needs to be checked. You need to be a competent organic bioengineer to be able to award such a certificate. So that kind of government control needs to be there, and also, of course, consequences when things go wrong. So those, I think, are the two strands. And I think that's important to recognize, because there is a risk in a EU human rights due diligence legislation or national human rights due diligence legislation that we turn this lack of accountability totally around and actually start seeing social auditors and certifiers as a way to exonerate liabilities of the companies that are their clients, provide them with a safe haven, see them actually as an entity that can take over human rights due diligence obligations, whereas actually the opposite needs to happen. There are companies with their own human rights due diligence obligations in their own right, but we also should start regulating these social auditors, these technical auditors much more scrupulously, so that even whenever they deliver something, that they start delivering a minimum of quality that you would expect.
Thank you very much, Ben. So you've taken us really into a deep dive of the sector. I would like to turn to Maria now and to the European, Ben also helped me bridging this to the European context where a supply chain law or a human rights due diligence law is in the making. The Commission is currently working on a draft, which is apparently is a difficult task because they have been delaying it a little bit. But the European Parliament already in March last year, I think it was, has presented the Commission with a resolution that has given some recommendations on what should be in a law and has really been quite, say, from our perspective, maybe progressive in many points in what such a law should contain. Now, my question, where are we at the moment? What are, in your view, as far as you can say, because I know that the Commission process is maybe not, it's not public. So could you already say something about the particularly controversial issues at the moment that need still more discussing from your perspective?
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you for organizing this meeting because it's really on time. As you know, the Commission will come with a proposal on the 15th of February. It seems to be really controversial at the Commission level because we were ready to receive this proposal in October 2021. They proposed something at the Commission, but finally they decided to postpone it to February. So it seems really difficult, not because they have no competence to do so, but I think that the lobby is really important to the Commission not to have this kind of regulation at the European level. As you know, we have this kind of due diligence regulation at the European level, but sectorial one. So we have this conflict minerals regulation that entered into force in January of this year, 2022, yeah, or 2021, I don't remember very well. We have the timber regulation and we have Kimberley regulation. So there is due diligence mechanism for specific issues, but I think it's with these regulations we can understand where the difficulties are when it comes to due diligence. And the experience that I had on the conflict mineral regulation can be used here in the due diligence mechanism that we are working on here at the European Parliament, and we are waiting to have this proposal coming from the Commission. The first controversial issue is the scope of this regulation. The scope when it comes to which company must be covered by this regulation. And so our proposal is to say that the companies that are by law under the member states law or established in the European territories, whatever their size, they have to be covered by this law and working outside Europe. On the scope also, we want to cover, and this is the position of the Parliament, we want to cover all the value chain. And so it was a very strong demand on the conflict minerals. And finally, in the trilogue, we didn't succeed in having the whole value chain. And we started with the the first level, so the mining sector, and not to the end of this value chain. And so we will have, I think, the same discussion with the council when it comes to the global value chain that we want to cover. The last point of the scope that will be difficult also with the Commission and the Council is that this regulation must cover all human rights issue and environmental risk. So there is a difficulty because companies said it's difficult for us to define what is human rights. And so we said that there are a lot of references to human rights, and so we can work on this. They are ready to work on environmental risk, but less on human rights issue. So it is really something that will be controversial with the Commission and with the Council. The second point of this controversial issue is the liability of companies. And for example, in the conflict minerals, we just have this due diligence issue on the value chain. So how it is possible for a company to have a process of due diligence, but we never succeed in having a sanction mechanism. And this is something that it can't work. So it will work till a certain point, but I think without a sanction mechanism, it will be very difficult to work with these due diligence. So for us, it is important to have a due diligence legislation that must ensure the civil liabilities of companies, and also a complaint mechanism allowing any stakeholders to raise concern about the existence of a potential or actual negative impact on human rights, environmental risk, and good governance, because we spoke about corruption also. So I think it's really, these three issues are really linked and interconnected. The third point is the remediation. This also will be a difficulty. So the due diligence legislation must provide access to justice and also include the possibility, and what I said, of sanction for companies who have been found responsible for adverse impact on human rights, environmental, and good governance. So these are the main controversial points that we know that we will have during the negotiation between the Commission and the Parliament, but also with the trilogue that we will have with the Council. As you know, in the European Parliament, you have progressive forces that wanted to have more on this due diligence issue, and you have more, I don't know if we have to speak about conservative, but more business-friendly forces that are refraining from this due diligence issue, and they are always using different arguments. The first one is administrative burden for SMEs, for example, and it is why they wanted to exclude SMEs. But as you know, an SMEs at the European level is 250 employees. So it is the big scope of global value chain is on this. So you have these MEPs that they just have this argument protecting SMEs. But in fact, I think that if you work on the whole value chain, in the upstream and downstream, you protect SMEs, because if the big companies are doing what they have to do, it will have an effect on the SMEs. So it's also something that you give to SMEs as facilitating their role for the due diligence. So it is not an administrative burden for SMEs. But, you know, Business Europe is just hiding behind the SMEs arguments just to say that they don't want to have this kind of regulation. And so this is the different difficulties that we will have in the negotiation. When it comes to the certificates, we have had this discussion on conflict minerals. And it is not to say that certification it is not interesting. We can work with it, but it has to be a complement of the due diligence issue. And it can't give the opportunity to a company to be excluded from their responsibility. So we need to have a real transparent mechanism for certification, being controlled, regulated, as Ben said, and also guaranteeing that nobody is avoiding his responsibility because the existing of a certificate. And it has been the same discussion on the industry schemes that we had in the conflict minerals issue. So it is really something that we can put as a complement, but not as a way of avoiding something. And finally, I would say that it is really on time to this kind of regulation, because with the Green Deal that we have, and I totally agree with what we are doing on the Green Deal, we will have in the future a very strong pressure in the mining sector for producing batteries, for example, but also so the dam in the mining sector, but also energy, water energy produced by dams. And so I think that due diligence is not the answer for everything. We also need to use due diligence as a deterrence effect from companies doing damages on this issue, but we also have to reflect on a kind of taxonomy. We have this taxonomy on environmental issue. There is a discussion on taxonomy. But I think it's important also to have a reflection on human rights taxonomy, and not to be there after the damages, but right before the damages, and to be sure that the investment can be channeled to investment that are free of human rights violation. And this is really something that we need to have in transparency, and we have to reflect about that in the future, because I think that the pressure, we are living in a very interconnected world, with a very high pressure to raw materials and also to new way of producing things. But we have to avoid what we have had, for example, with palm oil. We were thinking that palm oil will change and the need of fossil fuel. And finally, we destroyed biodiversity with this. So we really have to be cautious about what we are doing on this Green Deal, preserving indigenous people, preserving diversity, preserving life where people are living. And this is really something that we have to work on.
Thank you, Maria. Can I just ask you on, you mentioned the idea of a human rights taxonomy. For those like myself who are not really familiar, how would that look like? You mentioned that it would channel investment. Can you explain that a little bit more?
You know that the bank sector is really powerful. And if we want to give more transparency on what they are doing, we decided to have this taxonomy for green investments, and to be sure that the bank are selling products, financial products that are respectful of, that are respecting the Green Deal. And I think it is important to give this information also to by and to the bank sector when it comes to human rights. And so it's an idea, but I think it is necessary to have this transparency to be sure that investments are not fueling human rights violation. And for the moment, we don't have this kind of transparency when it comes to investment, bank investment.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Coming back to the law that is under discussion, you have mentioned, like Ben, that in addition, there would be maybe necessary some regulation for certification services. And my question is, in both regards, well, in relation to a possible certification regulation, is there already a discussion underway at some level? And also for the due diligence law, you as a parliamentarian, the European Parliament, when are you coming back into the process of the discussion? What is the plan? What's the schedule? And on what points would you maybe need support in a way from the affected people, from the organizations in the South? What do you need from them? Can they help you with information, with, I don't know, is there anything that can be helpful there to connect?
Yeah, on when are we going to come back around the table as the European Parliament? As soon as the Commission will issue the proposal on the 15th of February, we hope so. It is the Legal Affairs Committee that is in charge of this due diligence regulation. And so we will be directly associated to this proposal by the Legal Affairs Committee, and we will have opinions coming from other committees, just like Human Rights Committee, but I think that Trade Committee will be also in around the table when it comes to the opinion on this proposal. So as soon as the Commission put it on the table, the European Parliament will work on it, we hope that we will have a very strong position because we did it in a report. So we anticipate the position of the Parliament. So it will be easier for us to answer what the Commission will put on the table. What will be very difficult, it is if we are really far away from our positions. If the position of the Commission is really, really a low-level position, it will be difficult for the Parliament to regain this first position that we voted at the European Parliament. Because as you know, it was a very strong battle here, but if the Commission proposed something very low, a part of our MEPs, more business-friendly, will be satisfied with the Commission position. And so they will say, okay, we take it. And so we will see what will happen with the position of the Commission. But this is the discussion. And I think that it could be possible to have a European Parliament proposal by the end of this semester, so June, July. And after that, we will start a trilogue. Unfortunately,
So this, sorry, trialogue is between Parliament and Commission and the Council?
And the Council, yeah. Okay. So after this position of the Parliament, the Council need to have a mandate to negotiate on this proposal. And this will be the beginning of the discussion with the trilogue because it is a co-decision. And so perhaps by the end of this year, perhaps if the Council can agree on a mandate, we could come back to the Parliament for a vote. This is the most, I think, positive way of doing it, optimistic way of doing it by the end of this year. It is not sure. Perhaps it will be by the end of this legislature to have finally a due diligence issue. I forgot to say that often the Council is, when we have a decision on the trilogue between Commission, Parliament and the Council, we know that the Council asked for a long period of adaptation for the companies. So sometimes we voted in 2022 or 2023, but they asked to have entering into force 5 years later. And so it will be also something that we will have to negotiate with the Council, and not to have a too long period for entering into force. This is really important. When it comes to the certification, generally the Council is asking to take on board the certified industry schemes, because they know that things are happen for the moment. We are not living in a world without industry scheme regulation on this due diligence. And what they are asking for is to take on board the existing situation. So they are the one who are asking for something. For the moment, we are not asking for it, but we know that it is a part of the negotiation that we will have with them, because they will come with this proposal. We know that it will be a part of our discussion and negotiation about this regulation.
Okay, thanks for navigating us through that European jungle. Before I open the floor for further questions, and I have already here some on my screen coming from the audience, I would like to give the word back to Danilo, because it's not so often that you can directly meet Maria and Danilo and bring together the two worlds in Brazil and in Europe, because considering the interconnectedness between the two economies, no? Brazil is a huge market, but Brazil is also a very important supplier for, as you said, Maria, for the resource thirst that we have in Europe. Do you think, Danilo, that a European law on human rights obligations, on human rights due diligence for companies can really have an impact on Brazilian business? Or more specifically, what do you hope for? What would such a law need to have a positive impact in Brazil?
Thank you, Claudia, for this question, and also thank you, Maria, for your presentation. I am extremely happy because this is the second time we've met, and actually back in 2019 we met up in your office. I'm almost moved, if you want, to be here and discussing these topics again, because it means we're making headway, and so I would really like to thank you once again. I took part in the functions to commemorate the events, you know, and all of the communities there really want to make justice. It is clear that there's a need for more accountability. Clearly, other measures and provisions should have been taken, but many people actually feel very strongly the need to prevent further facts. Unfortunately, the feeling we have is that the Brazilian system is not able to provide satisfactory responses to these facts. Even the judiciary, if you want, or the representatives of our authority really feel they are unable to respond adequately. And so it is fundamental to involve European players because they do work with us. And there are some Brazilian organizations that have worked with international players and investors, especially from Europe. And clearly, Brazil takes advantage of these investments, and we need to make these economic players accountable. Mining of iron ore by Vale or many other, even foreign companies, is only possible because there are steel works in Europe that purchase the ore, the iron ore. There are also governmental agencies that fund such activities, for instance, and then there are the certifying agencies and bodies. There are also insurance companies that are involved in all of this, and many of these activities actually are played in Europe. And all of these players are fundamental for all of the mining industry. And therefore, what really happens is that daily violations take place. And this is why I believe very strongly that European people, as well as the MEPs, must, in a way, try to impose measures, must take initiative that can have an impact on the conduct of the players who exploits our territory, our land. Clearly, this law probably cannot solve these problems that date back to the colonization times, you know. This, as Maria rightly was saying, can only tackle a part of the problem, but we are hopeful that this new law that is being currently discussed in Europe can help make headway. Hopefully it will bring some benefits so that at least we can avoid further catastrophes and further tragedies such the ones that occurred. I would like to highlight the following. It is fundamental to make sure that people are involved, the members of the community that are most affected and impacted by this industry. I think this is very important for us. We think that the most important element is, being on board, being involved. We are following very closely your works, and we're even admiring what you are trying to do. And we're also very willing to share with you information and, cooperate and work with you so that we can overcome the lobby's interests and those who have interests that go against our communities. Once again, thank you, Maria Arena, and everyone. And once again, I would like to reiterate our willingness and our desire to dive deeper and, share information because our communities have a lot to say and they can contribute through their experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danilo, for this reflection. I would now go into the Q&A session. We have gathered a few questions that are directed to several different members of the panel. Each of you will have more opportunities to speak. I'll go for the first one, which goes to Ben and Danilo. You'll see maybe who of you can respond. And it says, can you please tell us whether it is the case that the contract for the certification of the dam at Brumadinho that broke was originally being done by another company, but that Vale actually chose to give the contract for the certification of the Córrego de Feijão dam to TÜV Süd when the previous company had not given a clean bill of health to the dam in their report. That's probably Danilo who would be the most competent person to respond, I guess.
Sim, as investigações...
Well, investigations showed that Vale was notified that there was a lack of stability, and other companies also shared this information with Vale. This was documented in the depositions. Even in 2017, Vale had an independent group of experts. For instance, the Potamos Engenharia. This company basically told them that the security index was lower than the acceptable threshold. And so we came to March 2018, and Vale was indeed quite concerned about the stability of the structure. These consultants from Potamos claimed that at a given point it was impossible to maintain the relationship with Vale, and ultimately the contract was passed to TUV that actually certified the stability. And then there is a number of detailed circumstances, but in a nutshell, the certification body was changed at a given time, because the contractor was basically unhappy with what was being told.
That probably speaks also to how TÜV Süd could assess or not the situation. The next questions, there are two which I will put together. They're not directed to anyone at the panel, so you can, while listening to it, think of whether you want to respond or if you have an idea to respond. One is on social auditors. There is no regulation of social auditors, but there is promotion by governments through procurement policies and integration of certificates like the FSC, or the FSC is, I think, on wood, and the RSPO on palm oil, as we mentioned. Integration of such certificates in due diligence regulations. How can we prevent this or challenge it? That's one question. And the second question is on independence and finance of certification and auditors. As Ben shared, we see that certification bodies lack independence as they continue to build on resources, information, and funds of the company that hires them. How could this be resolved? A solution that is often proposed is a jointly held fund administered by some form of neutral third party, which would pool and allocate direct payments. What are the panelists' views on this solution? It's open to whoever would like to respond. Anyone has an idea? Ben, yeah, do you want to give it a start?
Respond. Oh, sorry, my earphone fell out.
Question on public procurement. I think there's just also a larger debate in the sense that public procurement is currently regulated by an EU instrument, which does have some room for sustainability, but I think it's one of the follow-ups once we have the corporate sustainable governance initiative at least sufficiently solid to also revisit the public procurement directive to make sure that it is compatible with human rights due diligence, because the current logic, even the intervention logic with it, is just having friction with the human rights due diligence logic, and we need to adapt that so that, of course, you ask businesses to do a human rights due diligence process, that when the government or the state as an economic actor acts, also has similar obligations. And in that sense, then we indeed come to the same problems that, whereas we are advocating that companies should not rely solely on an RSPO or an FSC certificate, and certainly should not confuse that with genuine human rights due diligence. Similarly, governments should equally not just take the certificate as a given, but embed that within a larger due diligence obligation. On the conflict of interest, indeed, I agree with the analysis, but as always, it's actually slightly easier to make an analysis rather than come up with solutions. And such a joint fund sounds good, but runs probably quickly into all kinds of architectural problems in terms of governance, how to administer this, etc. Especially given the variety again of the landscape. So that's why our thinking goes much more into lines of increasing transparency, which again, Danilo mentioned first the NG assessment and then the TUV assessment. How come both of them can say something different? In a more transparent world, this would not or would be less of an issue. But also certainly next to transparency, to increase the accountability, making sure that auditors themselves are liable for acts and omissions that they made, and also that there is government oversight, that they regularly check, okay, this is a risky business, there might be risky consequences, as we see in the Brumadinho case, that government also then start checking, okay, what are these auditors doing, and are they doing their work, and are they up to whatever code and standard, which then also applies in a number of sectors, especially in the sectors of social audits that are not as regulated, that we do come to standards. And I think that probably joins the idea that Maria mentioned about the social taxonomy in order to build on that standard. But those are my initial ideas. I don't know if others have thoughts on that.
Thank you very much, Ben, for this insight. There are more questions. One goes directly to Maria about the EU due diligence law. And it says, thank you for the interesting presentation. Yes, liability in due diligence law is crucial. I am wondering if you could elaborate more on liability in the upcoming EU due diligence law. What should or what will the provision on civil liability look like, as far as you can say? Is it similar to tort law? And if yes, I think it will miss the chance to really bring value added or an added value, because tort law mechanism already exists, but many victims still find it difficult to claim remedy. So what could a liability mechanism add actually to the already existing tort mechanisms? And there's a second question that I just add to you. This question also for you, for Maria. You mentioned that companies are generally more opposed to a regulation focused on human rights, while being more positive to a regulation focused on environmental risks. Why do you think that is the case?
Yeah. So for the second part, I think that it's easier for a company to identify an environmental risk, and so to try to cope with this situation and work on this environmental risk. It is more difficult for companies, and they said that when it comes to human rights, they don't have exactly the same reference on which to work in different countries. And so they said that, for example, we have labor rights. They can use the ILO standards. They can use the different labor rights in different countries. And it is more vague when it comes to human rights. It is what they said, and they have no really power on this. I don't share this point of view, but this is the argument of the economic sector. So I think that we have enough references at the international level, at the UN level, on the human rights. And for me, it is not difficult to work on this, but I just say what I hear coming from the companies. So we have to argument, and we have to just have more argument to the companies to say that, yes, it is possible on the due diligence and on the global value chain to work on this. Labor rights is a part of this, but it is not only labor rights. Forced labor, for example, child labor, respects for example, guaranteeing access to water. It is not an environmental rights, it is a human rights when it comes to access to water for people, access to land for people, not being under threat when they are organizing dissident voice, for example, when we are working on the mining sector where indigenous people are living. And so everything can be managed on this human rights umbrella. So I think that we have to push for it when it comes to negotiating with the business sector. When it comes to the liability, I think that the national laws that we have on due diligence in France, in Germany, can show us the way we can work on liabilities of companies. I can't go in the detail of the report of the European Parliament report, but I think that we took these piece of legislation that we have in France, for example, and we took it at the European level. And what we said is, of course, we can do it at a national level, but it is less comfortable for companies to have different pieces of legislation in different countries than having this piece of legislation at the European level. So, because the standards will be exactly the same, and the responsibilities of companies and the way they have to respond for the responsibility will be exactly the same in Germany, in France, or in another country, because we have big companies and they have activities in Europe and all over the world, but not only in one country in Europe. So what we are trying to do is having this harmonization of liability at the European level, taking the situation in each member states. And for me, it's taking the strongest responsibility that we have in the piece of legislation. I don't know if the German one is the strongest or the French one, but we are trying to have the highest level of responsibility of companies.
Thank you very much. I was asked here in the chat also to explain, for those who are not so familiar, what there was mentioned in that question, tort. What is tort? Tort is a law that basically exists in all jurisdictions, that says that you can ask for compensation if somebody has caused you a damage, even if you don't have a contract with that. But anybody who causes a damage to you needs to pay compensation for that. So, as you say, Maria, is more about harmonizing these laws, and also basing them, of course, on a human rights basis rather than on an economic analysis of what constitutes a damage. It's mainly about harmonization. But yes, some cases are already brought under the tort regulations. That's true. There's a question. We have a few minutes left, and so I ask for short answers if possible. There's one question to Danilo. You talked about the victims and people of Brumadinho being re-victimized, and that the crimes that have occurred continue to take place. Could you please elaborate more about how the original crime that took place is being exacerbated by what has and is happening now? Including the heavy rainfalls and floods, they now create new risks for the stability of dams and the breaking of dams close to populated areas. Now, that's a tricky question to respond in a short time frame. That's a challenge for you. Give it a try.
Thank you for your question. I'll try and be quick, although it's really a bit of a challenge. Here in Brumadinho, people got used to this. And they even say the 25th is every day. And the reason is that the dam failure happened on the 25th of January. But this kind of saying means that people really wake up every day and go to bed perceiving that they are still feeling these effects, these impacts. You see, there are many examples I could give you that justify this perception by people. Today, I talked about the floods of Rio Paraopeba. The river basically carried on tons of cubic meters of sludge. And with the heavy rain linked to climate change and extreme weather events, the river basically brought up to the surface the sludge that were buried. And so people had to flee, had to leave their house, and many are left homeless. The sludge that was left everywhere in the city really brings back painful memories of the dam break that occurred 3 years ago. And there are other works that are being done to repair the situation, which is causing more problem. A canal is being built to basically create a detour for the water, and some people are being evicted from their houses. So think that people are still suffering the impact of this. And when you switch on the TV or when you watch a video on YouTube, people have to deal with a sort of propaganda about this. But just remember this. This is my take-home message. Here in Brumadinho, everyone says the 25th of January is every day.
Thank you. Thank you, Danilo. There's one last question that I would still like to fit in the panel. There's one technical question on audit reporting about who has actually seen the audit report. I referred the person who asked that happily to respond that via email to ECCHR, because that's a very technical question. We can go into depth at another level, but this question is interesting. A worrying issue is that in legislative developments on due diligence, auditors and certification bodies could become responsible for a verification of human rights due diligence and assist companies in gauging whether a company has done enough to address human rights impacts. This would create a new business model for the audit market, but also present another potential conflict of interest in the framework of mandatory human rights due diligence, when auditors hired by the company need to assess their own human rights impact and that of their client, as well as make independent certification decisions. Do the panelists have a view on this issue, in particular, maybe Maria? I know it's a tricky one, or Ben.
It is a tricky one, because it is always something that we have to control and to be certified. But what is the answer is really transparency. It is necessary to have a procedure to be transparent. We can't have a risk zero, so it is not possible. But the more we have transparency, the more we have people that can see the way people are working. And so regulation, transparency, liability are really the three pillars that we need to guarantee that we can succeed in and avoiding the loophole of this kind of regulation. So risk zero, it doesn't exist, but we have to build these 3 pillars to guarantee that the loophole are really, we close the door of these kind of things. But yeah, we can imagine that we will always find something, somewhere, someone who will try to avoid this kind of regulation. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Well, that gives us a prospect of a road out of this dilemma. So I think that's a very interesting answer. Thank you so much, Maria. Given that the time's actually over, I wanted to give you a last round of last words, but I don't think we have time for this. I would just close the session thanking you all at the panel. First of all, thank you for your time and your intense deep dive into these issues. It's very important, I think, that we connect the European technical level and the level of impacts in Brazil, and always keep that in mind. I'm really delighted. I didn't know that Danilo and Maria had met before, and you're meeting again, and this will not have been the last time. Thank you so much. That's great. Yes, it's an issue in progress. We need to continue the conversation. It's difficult. Not everything is resolved. We need to keep up the conversation, and hopefully across continents. I thank the panelists very much. I thank also the co-organizers. Again, Maria is also co-organizer of this. And Danilo representing Renza, co-organizer, and Ben representing ECCHR, as well as all the others. That's SITSE, that's Miserio, DKA, and Caritas Brazil. That was the whole group of organizers supporting this event and supporting the struggle of the people on the ground. I also thank very much our wonderful translators, Beatrice and Mariolina, for doing very tough work on this, especially with me, who speaks too quickly all the time. And thank you very much, our technical support, who has put up the whole platform and is organizing the live stream. And the live stream versions will also be put up on Facebook and probably, hopefully also on YouTube for the Portuguese version to look and share with friends later on. And with this, all thanks to you, I would close the session. But that's not the end of the story. I hope we will remain in conversations over the next year or this coming year on the proposal, and also on the lucha that continues in Brazil, of course. Thank you very much, and have a good evening.